From the shifting shadows of imagination to the blinding light of terror, this is One Tale to Midnight.
When I was 10, Emily Sutherland was the first girl I ever called my girlfriend. She was a bright, intense girl, always with a wicked grin and a sharp wit. We spent our summers riding bikes down dusty roads, sneaking through cornfields, and daring each other to jump off the old bridge into Miller's Creek. Life back then was simple, innocent. But life moved on, as it always does. My family moved to another town, and Emily became a distant memory. I never thought I'd see her again. Not until 20 years later, when she came back into my life like a storm. It started when my wife Julie and I moved back to my childhood hometown. We'd bought an old colonial on the outskirts, surrounded by thick woods and long stretches of untamed land. We wanted quiet evenings where we could sit on the back porch and listen to the crickets. For a while, it was perfect. I'd find myself staring out at the yard, the cool autumn wind brushing past my face, and feel a deep sense of peace. That peace shattered the day Emily showed up. I was unloading groceries when I first saw her. She was standing at the end of our driveway, her long dark hair pulled back, eyes fixated on me. There was something unsettling about her posture, rigid and unyielding. When she caught me looking, her face broke into a smile, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that you feel deep in your gut, the one that turns your blood cold. "Hey, Ben," she called, her voice too casual for someone I hadn't seen in 2 decades. "It's been a while." I felt my stomach twist. "Emily, I didn't know you were back in town." "I am," she said, stepping closer. "I came back for old friends." Weeks passed, and what started as casual run-ins became more frequent. I'd see Emily at the grocery store, standing behind me in line, close enough that I could smell the sharp tang of her perfume. She'd leave small notes on our porch. "Remember when we used to play hide and seek? I found you every time." Julie started to notice the unease that crept over me. "Is that the same Emily you used to talk about? The one from your childhood?" she asked one night as we lay in bed. Her brows knitted with concern. "Yeah," I admitted. I kept my voice calm, but my chest felt like it was being squeezed. "She's changed." Julie nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced everything was under control. Then the calls started. First, they were silent, a heavy breathing on the other end before hanging up. At first, we thought it was prank calls, a nuisance at most. But then she spoke. "Ben," she'd whisper, "I miss our summers." "Don't you?" I hung up so hard the phone cracked against the table. My heart raced as the realization sank in deeper. Emily was more than just an old flame. She was an obsession. One night, after a particularly unsettling knock at the door that revealed nothing but an empty porch and a note scrawled in looping handwriting, "You belong to me," Julie convinced me to file a restraining order. I thought that would be enough to stop her. I was wrong. Emily's reaction was immediate and unhinged. She began showing up at odd hours, staring through our windows with an intensity that left chills running down my spine. One morning, Julie found our mailbox smashed and a red smear of what looked like animal blood across the front door. "I can't live like this, Ben!" Julie's voice trembled as she stood in the kitchen, clutching a knife as if it were a lifeline. "We have to do something more." The police offered to patrol the area, but Emily was careful, cunning. There were never any cameras, never any witnesses. It was as if she knew every move we made. It wasn't until a week later that the pieces began to come together. I had been at work when Emily showed up, a Tupperware of food in her hands, eyes wide and gleaming. She pushed it across my desk. "I made you lunch," she said, the sweetness in her tone masking something much darker. I stared down at the Tupperware, my mind stalling. It was my container, one we'd been looking for in the kitchen. The realization hit me like ice water down my spine. Emily hadn't just been watching us. She had been inside our home. I rushed home, dread knotting my insides, and told Julie everything. Her eyes widened, a mix of fear and fury bubbling up. She's been living here, hasn't she? Julie's voice was a harsh whisper. We searched the house, every creak and shadow feeling more sinister by the second. Then we found it, a small hidden crawl space in the attic, with a worn blanket, food wrappers, and a diary filled with pages upon pages of scrawled notes about us. The entries were unsettling, detailing our daily routines, and even mentioning how she watched us sleep. Julie and I agreed that I'd change the locks the next day, but fate had other plans. The next morning, Julie called me at work, her voice trembling. "Ben, she's here." My heart stopped. "Get out of the house," I said, panic clawing at me. But Julie wasn't one to run. When I arrived, the front door was ajar. Inside, the living room was chaos, paper scattered, a chair tipped over. Emily stood in the middle of the room, her eyes wild, a bat clenched in her hand. "Why did you try to take him from me?" Emily shouted, her voice cracking with rage. Julie stood her ground, hands steady as she pointed the gun. "Get out, Emily, now!" Emily's eyes flickered between us, a feral glint sparking before she lunged. Emily moved faster than I expected, swinging the bat with a strength born of desperation. Julie sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the arc of polished wood as it whistled past her ear. The bat connected with the edge of the dining table, splintering it on impact. The force of the swing sent shockwaves through the room, and I could hear Julie's sharp intake of breath as she steadied herself. "Put it down, Emily," I shouted, my voice straining to stay level, as I took a cautious step closer. She turned to face me, her chest heaving, eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, I saw the girl I once knew, the one who dared me to leap off the old bridge, laughing as if the world belonged to us. But that memory dissolved as she took another step forward. The bat gripped so tightly in her hands that her knuckles turned white. "You don't get it, do you, Ben?" she said, her voice cracking into a high-pitched tremor. "We're meant to be together. I've always known it. Even when they locked me up, I knew." Julie's gun remained steady, her fingers flexed on the trigger. "Emily, back away. I don't want to hurt you, but I will." Emily let out a laugh, hollow and brittle. It was the sound of someone who had lost their last tether to reality. She dropped the bat suddenly, the wood clattering on the floor. For a brief moment, hope flickered in me. But it vanished just as quickly when she lunged at Julie, her hands outstretched like claws. The room erupted into a blur of movement. Julie fell backward, the gun discharging, with a deafening crack that seemed to make the walls shudder. Emily recoiled, eyes wide with shock as she stumbled, a crimson stain blossoming across her shoulder. But even then, there was no fear in her eyes, only fury. "You think you can keep him from me?" she hissed, the blood running down her arm like ribbons of ink. She staggered but didn't stop, lunging again with a ferocity that made my heart seize. I moved without thinking, grabbing a heavy lamp from the side table and bringing it down on her back. Emily crumpled to the floor with a cry that cut through the chaos, her body folding like a rag doll. The silence that followed was so profound that it roared in my ears. Julie was breathing hard, eyes wide and unblinking as she kept the gun trained on Emily's prone form. The room felt like it was spinning, the edges of my vision blurring as adrenaline coursed through me. She's still breathing," Julie said, her voice barely above a whisper. I knelt beside Emily, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. A faint pulse throbbed beneath her skin. Relief flooded me, mingled with a deep, gnawing dread. "We need to call the police," I said, looking up at Julie. She nodded, her eyes never leaving Emily, as she shakily reached for the phone. The minutes that followed felt like hours. We sat on the porch steps, the cool morning air biting at our skin, as the wail of sirens grew louder in the distance. When the police arrived, their questions came in a rapid-fire sequence. Officers swarmed our house, flashlights casting beams of light across the disheveled living room and up to the attic, where the hidden space told its own story. The paramedics carried Emily out on a stretcher, her eyes fluttering open just long enough to meet mine. For the first time, there was no rage, no obsessive gleam, just emptiness. It took months for life to return to a semblance of normalcy. Emily was transferred to a psychiatric hospital after her arrest, where it was confirmed that she had spent 5 years in an institution following her previous breakdown, an episode that had ended with her poisoning an ex-boyfriend's dogs and violently assaulting his sister. The restraining order was made permanent, though it seemed like a formality at that point. Julie and I replaced the locks, installed cameras, and took other precautions that made our once cozy home feel like a fortress. But even with those measures, I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, certain that I'd heard footsteps in the hall or the soft creak of the attic door. Julie would hold my hand, squeezing it tight enough to reassure me that we were safe, that Emily couldn't touch us anymore. And I would tell myself the same over and over until the darkness no longer whispered her name. One evening, months after the incident, I received a letter. The handwriting was familiar, looping, and precise. My hands trembled as I tore it open, the paper crackling in the silent kitchen. The note was brief, but it chilled me to the bone. You'll always be mine, Ben, even if I have to wait forever. The nightmare wasn't over. It never really would be. But as Julie wrapped her arms around me, anchoring me to the present, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. And Emily, wherever she was, would never again come between us.